Okay, we're live. Kim, feel free to take it away.
All right. Hello, everybody. Happy Wednesday. Thanks everyone for being here. This is the 6th meeting of the Energy Code Board, and we're going to go ahead and dive right in because we have a lot to cover today. Our agenda for the day, I'm sorry, I've got a cute cat that can't get off my desk. Our agenda for the day. So we're going to start by reviewing the agenda and approving the minutes from meeting number 5. We'll move then into and it's not included on this agenda, a quick update on where we landed with adjusting our board schedule to accommodate for the public comment period that we discussed and approved last time. Then we'll spend a few minutes just wrapping up any discussion or questions on the Solar Ready amendments. We sent out answers to all of the questions that were posed in the last meeting, so we'll just make sure there's no additional follow-up from folks. And then we'll carve out a couple of minutes for board members to bring up, if you guys would like, and discuss any of the public comments or code proposals that we've received to date. Once we get through all of that, we'll dive into the EV ready stuff. And so we'll start by looking at the state statute definitions for EV readiness and all that was included within the state statute to set the baseline expectation for what we need to develop as a board according to the statute. Then we'll dive into commercial EV ready codes. We'll start again with those required elements per state statute, and then we'll move to a discussion on what we're deeming additional elements. So things that might be nice to have in the code language, but would not be required to have. And then once we wrap up commercial, we'll dive into residential and do the same thing. And we'll hope that 3 hours is enough time to get through it all, because this is a very complicated subject matter, as you all are well aware. So with that, I'd like to move us into the approval of the meeting minutes from meeting number 5. So I'll, if any of the board have any suggested changes to those minutes or would like to make a motion to approve them, please go ahead.
I'll motion to approve the minutes.
Second.
Thank you, Ron. Thank you, Tim. All in favor?
Aye.
Aye. Aye.
Aye. Any opposed? All right, awesome. Meeting minutes approved. Thank you, Ron, and thank you, Tim, for the motion. So now we'll move into a quick update on how we're planning to adjust the board schedule to accommodate the public feedback session that we voted and approved as a board last meeting.
Kim, can I interrupt for one second? I just wanted
to,
sorry about that. I just wanted to get on the record that Will Tor has named Adam Berry as his designee on the board. I just wanted that to be read into the record. So
wonderful.
if anyone has any questions, you could ask about.
Any questions for David on that?
Great, thank you all.
Great, thanks, David. Okay, so as far as looking ahead at our schedule, so following this meeting, we will be sending out a scheduling poll to the board that will have, we'll look at options to add another meeting into our lineup of meetings between now and the end of March in order to accommodate and make sure that we have enough time to have our preliminary votes, our public comment session, and then our final votes. We think we need another meeting within our series of meetings, and then an additional one at the end as well. So our plan is to add one meeting either the week of February 27th or the week of March 13th. Both of those weeks we don't currently have a board meeting scheduled. So I'll be following up with a scheduling poll to find a day time that works best during those 2 weeks for the board. Then looking ahead at our schedule, meeting 11, which is on March 28th, the plan for this meeting will be the first hour and a half. We'll open it up. We'll allow folks from the public to give their comments. And then we'll spend the last hour and a half as a board discussing any of those comments and flagging those that we want to make sure we're responsive to within the code language. And then we'll be scheduling a final meeting on Friday, March March 31st, where we will bring up where we will have sort of final discussion and vote on any elements that got brought up in the public engagement meeting number 11, that the board wanted to adjust the code language to. So the goal is in meeting number 11, we will have that time to discuss and think through what the changes would look like. And then it'll be a very quick turnaround, and we'll ask you guys to vote a couple days later after you've had time to process. Carolyn.
Hi, Kim. I just wanted to open up and just note that because that is the voting meeting, it's really important that we have good attendance there. I'm also cognizant that the end of March is often a travel time for people. So I'm just wondering if we could test that date with everyone and make appropriate adjustments just to maximize the ability of our voting members to participate, given that that wasn't already on our calendar.
Yeah, absolutely. And Adam, do you want to speak to that?
Sure, happy to. Thanks for raising that, Carolyn. I think that's really a really important point. I will note that I think that, you know, we tried to work out this plan based on what was decided in the last meeting, where, you know, the board really indicated a desire to like review and vote on, you know, kind of do an initial vote on all of the elements and kind of have, you know, the board's proposed code kind of finalized before that public engagement meeting. And then, you know, Kim and I felt in that discussion that, you know, if we're going to open it up to a public meeting, that we really should offer some opportunity for that to be, those comments to be discussed, and potentially, if any changes are needed, to vote on those afterwards. Because if we're not going to discuss it and not going to provide an opportunity for any changes after a public meeting, then I think we kind of determine what is the purpose of a public meeting. And so I think that was really the intent behind it. I agree with you that if we can be flexible within those last few days of March, that we should be able to do scheduling wise. I just think, you know, we're working on a very tight timeline. That meeting 11 will actually be meeting 12 once we schedule a new one. And then, you know, we have until April 1st to finalize this thing before anything will be kicked to the executive committee. So just trying to be cognizant of not, you know, slamming a bunch of meetings onto people's calendars all within the same week, but also recognizing that, you know, we don't want people to have to kind of, you know, shotgun vote on things that the public may have brought up in the second half of that meeting without having an opportunity to think about it and discuss it. So that's just to give you a little background of the thinking behind trying to develop this new schedule.
Yeah, absolutely. And I wholly support the proposal. My only flag was, and I have no issue with the 31st, so I will just offer that. I just think that if anybody does, and we recognize that it's going to undermine having enough of our voting members there, we should simply look at a different date, since we are adding that meeting. I definitely support adding the meeting, just striving to make sure that we're at least starting from a place where we have enough voting members to meet the statutory requirements.
Yeah, thanks, Carolyn. And I'll also flag that, you know, our approach as of right now is to continue in meetings 9 through 11 in conducting that vote with the board on all of the code language. That is the code language that will be brought forward to the public, that they'll have the opportunity to comment on. And then the final meeting where we'll do final voting will be if there's any changes that we think need to be made from our like preliminary set of voting. So hopefully in our first set of meetings, we'll have most of the votes locked in, and then any changes that need to happen after the public outreach and comment and discussion, those we can go back and revote on any elements that need to be changed. So I guess we're hopeful that it won't be all of the elements, but again, who really knows? Any other thoughts or questions on our new plan moving forward, or our adjusted plan moving forward? Okay, I'm not hearing any. Carolyn, to your point, we can make sure we throw some options in for March 31st as well as March 30th as well as March 31st, just to make sure we're looking at all available options for that final meeting to accommodate folks' schedules. And if anyone has a serious concern with those dates, feel free to let Adam and I know ahead of sending out that scheduling poll, and we can adjust as needed. Okay. So now I want to move us to wrapping up and just sort of tying a bow on some of the outstanding questions we had from the Solar Ready discussion at our last meeting. So a couple of questions that came up during the meeting included the first two on the slide there. Why does the Solar Ready requirement have the 150 square foot minimum for townhomes? And I think, oh, there we go. And then the second question was, why does the residential Solar Ready appendix have a capped penetration requirement only for low sloped roofs? We sent both of these questions over to Hope Medina with Shums Coda, and she provided her responses that I shared via email. So based on what I shared, are there any follow-up questions for our team on the two answers that came from Hope? Okay. I am not hearing any. Fantastic. So then the third question that got brought up, which was a larger question around how we want to interpret the statute, was, does the state statute require conduit to be installed for Solar Ready, or does the space just need to be provided for the conduit and indicated on the plans on where that conduit can run? So we shared the statute interpretation with you guys via email, so hopefully none of you or all of you received that. And our plan to incorporate that statute interpretation into the code language is to provide the code language options for both, and at that time have the discussion with the board on whether we like the approach to include conduit or to not include the conduit. I also wanted to just remind folks that Carolyn reached out to the Colorado Solar and Storage Association to ask the installers that are part of that association on whether or not conduit is really helpful when solar installers are going in to add solar to existing homes. And the response that we received was also forwarded to the board. The truncated version of that, I'll just read out loud, is the conduit is unusable in some situations and an extra cost that may not provide much benefit. It sort of summarizes the thoughts that we received back from them. Are there any, Adam or David, I guess, do you have anything to add to that last bullet?
I don't think I have anything to add. Happy to answer any questions or discuss it if anyone wants to.
Thanks, David. Any questions or comments from the board? Ron.
Yeah, I was just curious if it sounds like it's part of the legislation. So could we, if we wanted to, I don't think we could just eliminate the requirement for conduit. Am I understanding that correctly?
That's right. You can't eliminate the requirement for conduit. What you can do is meet the requirement in the way that, based on your experience and knowledge, technical expertise, you think best makes sense.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, David. Okay, any other final thoughts or questions on Solar Ready before we continue on with our agenda? Okay, fantastic. So moving along, the next part of our meeting today, we wanted to open up the floor to see if any board members had read and any of the public comments or the code proposals that we've received through the open portal, and bring those up for discussion. So I will open the floor for any board members if you guys would like to bring up any comments. Carolyn.
Yeah, I just wanted to acknowledge that we did receive 3 comments that are specific to today's discussion around the EV Ready codes, which were one from the city of Denver, one from Tesla, and then one from, I believe it was from, I have to go back and look now. I believe it was from the Sierra Club or one of our environmental groups. I guess, yeah, a group of advocates that shared that. So I just wanted to flag those if folks had not seen them to maybe take a quick look as we go through these discussions. I think most of the comments were just encouraging adoption of the EV ready codes without any specifics. Denver definitely offered some clarification and comments around why they set their requirements where they were. That might be useful as we go through the discussion.
Thank you, Carolyn. Does anyone have anything else that they'd like to bring up from the public comments? And if anyone needs the link to that public comment doc, it was sent out to the board with the meeting 6 agenda.
And note that it is always available publicly on CEO's Energy Code Board page. Anyone from the public can find that. I will apologize for the restriction changes that have been happening with some of our public documents. Google has been giving us trouble, but if you ever can't access that for any reason, please just let me know and we'll make sure to make sure that it's public.
And I'll just note that the public comment number 5 was from Xcel Energy.
Thanks, Jason. Okay. Any other? Oh, Ron, yes.
I apologize for backing up a little bit, but the comments from Hope Medina on the previous agenda item, I'm having trouble finding those comments. I'm wondering if it'd be possible to resend those.
Yeah, absolutely. Those were sent in the meeting number 5 notes email.
Ron, I'll go through and re-forward it to you.
I appreciate that. Thank you.
Okay. Yeah. Thanks, Adam. Thanks, Ron. Okay. Any other questions, thoughts on public comments? All right. I'm not hearing any. So with that, we are going to dive into EV readiness standards for the day. I just want to preface before we dive in, there is a lot of detail and information within these. So as we go through, it's really helpful. I would consider it helpful if you guys had pulled up the EV Ready code language document summary that Adam put together for the board that includes all of the code language options from across the state. And we'll do our best to take you guys through step by step to make sure it's clear as day as much as we can. So with that, Allie, I'll pass it over to you.
Thanks, Kim. So first of all, we wanted to go over what was required in the statute and then sort of compare that to how well the draft 2024 IECC EV Ready language matched up to meeting those requirements. So first of all, the statute language says that the model electric ready and solar ready code must apply to commercial and residential buildings and must include EV ready and EV capable requirements for residential buildings and EV ready, EV capable, and EV supply equipment installed requirements for multifamily and commercial buildings with provisions for electrical service capacity in 20% or more of the vehicle parking spaces in the garage or parking area. So what does that mean exactly? It means that the board, if you go to the next slide, basically the board has to make decisions on these 3 key areas, which is for commercial and multifamily. We have to decide on what EV ready, what EV capable, and EV SE installed requirements should apply to multifamily as well as commercial buildings. And there also has to be a decision made on space allocation in keeping in mind that minimum of 20% parking spaces. And then for residential, the board has to decide on what EV ready and or EV capable requirements should apply to residential buildings. Beyond that, any additional code elements or considerations that you want to get more specific on or something, those are up to your discretion as the board. So just to review the definitions for all of these terms, in the state statute, the key things to remember for EV capable is that that includes electric panel capacity and conduit for future EV charging, the minimum of 208 volts and 40 amp rated circuits, and the parking space has to be adjacent to where the conduit terminates. And that is inclusive of like 2 spaces if the conduit is terminating adjacent to or between those 2 spaces. The key differences in EV ready from EV capable is that that first requirement also includes raceway wiring, receptacle, and circuit overprotection devices for future EV charging. Otherwise, they're pretty similar. And then they define EVSE as either EV charging system that has a power capacity of at least 6.2 kilowatts and the capacity to connect to the internet, or a similar situation in an inductive residential charging system for EVs that is certified through some certification system, and then is compliant with Article 625 of the National Electrical Code, Energy Star certified, and can also connect to the internet. So basically we looked at those statute requirements and then compared to what was in the draft language for the 2024 IECC EV Ready Code. And it does, we found that the IECC does pretty well at meeting the statute requirements. You can find the electrical panel capacity and the conduit requirements defined in both the commercial and residential code in these specific sections here in this table, as well as the minimum voltage and amperage in this section of the code. And then the parking space situation is also addressed through their definition of EV capable spaces, as well as their subsections on quantity. As for EV ready, because they are pretty similar, you'll find that the IECC does pretty well with addressing that. They do include in their general definition section some information on their requirements for raceway wiring. The receptacle is also included in those general definitions. Just note that it's a little bit general as to what that can mean. The definition includes sort of this more general outlet, junction box, or receptacle language. And then circuit overprotection devices are mentioned in these subsections on circuit capacity and management. Next slide. And then as for EVSE, the electric vehicle service equipment, they do not specify a need for internet connection. They do meet the requirement for power capacity, but they also are a little bit more vague, or not vague, but they don't have this other option for EVSE that is defined in the statute. So next slide, here are some examples of where the IECC includes some additional code elements that aren't exactly named in the statute. And so they're a little bit more specific as to how they determine like what adjacent means for that definition of EV ready or EV capable space. They define that as within 3 feet of the parking space that conduit or whatever has to terminate. And then they get a little bit more specific about the quantity of EV ready and or EV capable parking spaces and include some exceptions. And then there are some minimum capacity requirements defined specifically for when the charging is controlled by load management systems. And then they also have some requirements around like the installation of EV service equipment in accordance with some accessibility requirements and other code sections. And so you'll find those marked with that lightning symbol that we included in last presentation. So just those are just some key points to bear in mind, that where the IECC gets a little bit more specific than the code, the statute requirements. So Kim will take you through the rest of that code. And yeah, I'll turn it back to you, Kim.
Thank you so much, Allie. And before we go through and start to look at the specific code language, are there any questions about the definitions that are included in state statute or anything about what Allie just shared? Okay, we're all following along so far. That's great. Okay, so, oh, Elizabeth, yeah.
But I couldn't get my headset to come on. I had a question come up the other day, and I'm not sure if this is the right time to ask it, but it was about the definition of parking spaces and how those might fit into the definitions or the calculations of how many spaces are then required. And it was sort of unique situations, like in this space where you might have what they call them, the car elevators. If you have stacked automobiles, if that counts as multiple spaces. And another one had to do with tandem spaces and different street parking spaces. And this may not be the place to clarify the definition of that, but it did come up, and it was a tricky question that we shot back to the jurisdiction to help for a definition there.
And Elizabeth, just to follow up on that question, is there a definition of parking spaces within the IBC or other code book that can be referenced, or is there nothing?
I was looking for it, and I have not found it yet. So I don't know if anyone on the call may be able to point us to that, just to make sure that that is defined somewhere.
Yeah, this is Kevin.
Kevin.
I think the parking spaces are going to be defined in local zoning rather than in building code. So there's not a statewide definition or a code defined definition of parking spaces, including weird things like you said, tandem, stackers, compact spaces, all of that.
Thanks, Kevin. So it sounds like what Elizabeth, what I'm gauging you're getting at is we need to figure out what we mean when we say parking space. If we're allocating, 15% parking spaces must be XYZ EV ready standard. What do we mean when we say that? Are we talking about tandem or stacked or classic or off street or on street?
Yeah, and if Kevin says if that is just something that has to go back to the local zoning code, then maybe we just make reference to that this code isn't attempting to define that, or that it's not attempting to override anything that might be part of a local zoning code.
Awesome. Yeah, thanks, Elizabeth, for bringing that up. Adam and then Carolyn. Oh,
I was just going to say that I agree. I think it is, up to the local zoning code to kind of define this. And I think that, and maybe we can ask Carolyn or Ron or others who have this kind of stuff in their codes about how that plays with the, how the zoning code is used to define these types of things when they adopt an energy code that includes references to parking spaces.
Yeah, I was just going to offer that I don't believe we need to define that here. I think we just need to be cognizant of the fact that it will be defined based on zoning requirements and the type of construction project that it is, and it will vary even within a jurisdiction based on the zoning. But I don't think that that's necessary to deal with the energy code and EV ready requirements. Like I don't think we need to consider that here. I will generally say I don't think most jurisdictions consider stacking, which would be probably the only consideration that I can think of that would be relevant for us in terms of placement of terminated conduit. So I think we always think of it as ground level and fairly consistently as what you would think of as a parking space. And we would not consider like on street as part of the building itself. It would only be a consideration in terms of what the property had to build on site relative to its zoning. So that's my take on it.
Thanks, Carolyn. Tim.
Yeah, thank you. So from a technical standpoint, the IBC and the other codes, if they don't have the definition specifically in those codes, they just reference back for us to use any acceptable dictionary. Used to be Merriam's, but now they took that away and just said an acceptable dictionary. So, and I don't have a dictionary in front of me to see what that definition is, but that's how the I codes are set up.
Thanks, Tim, for that additional context. Okay. Awesome. Any other questions about state statute definitions before we dive in? Okay. Awesome. So we are going to start this process similar to how we started the Solar Ready process, with walking through the code sections one at a time. And the base code section, or the base code that we determined would be the best fit to use as our basis for discussion in this meeting, is the 2024 draft IECC EV Ready code. The reason being that EV Ready code language is the most discussed code standard for EV readiness based on the IECC's process. And so we felt it was the most well-vetted version of an EV Ready code to use as our baseline. And note, if the board does not like the 2024 code language, this is not us saying this is the code language we're going to build our code language off of. This is just the starting point for the discussion. So as a quick reminder, we've talked about the definitions for these in state statute, but just a quick reminder on the terminology here and what we mean when we say EV capable, EV ready, EV installed. Okay, so we're going to start our commercial discussion with the quantity and space allocation discussion. As we have EV capable, EV ready, and EV supply equipment defined in statute, really we see the biggest next decision that the board needs to make is how many of each of those spaces are we going to require in a commercial and multifamily building. So again, we need to allocate a percentage of EV capable, EV ready, and EV installed spaces for multifamily and commercial buildings that meet the 20% threshold at a minimum. And then the other thing that I'd like to discuss within this space allocation discussion is a couple of our communities across the state, and it's also included within the 2024 language, have substitution options for if a community puts in a level 3 charger, that counts as 3 EV installed spaces. Or if you put in extra level 2 chargers, that counts towards your EV readiness requirements. So thinking, the other thing we want to talk about is how the board would like to consider those substitutions for space types within the allocation, within the space allocation. And before we start, I just wanted to review the the results of the survey that we sent the board, and we got 11 responses to the survey. So thank you for those who took the time to take it. But that, knowing that does not represent the full board's opinion. So we asked first, what would be your preference for how we allocate spaces within this code language? And we asked everybody to rank them. So by first choice, second choice, third choice. So the first choice, which received 55% of the vote, is percentage allocation based on the total number of spaces. The second choice was that combination where it's based on the total number of spaces, but there is a specific requirement for multifamily that's different from the rest of the occupancies. And then the last, the third choice that came in, again, and it was 55% of the vote across the board, was a percentage allocation based on based on occupancy type. So just wanted to share that result that these first two seem like the ones that we're leaning towards, which is a total number of spaces, perhaps broken out by multifamily. And then we asked the question of the board, do we feel in the context of commercial buildings that space allocation should go above 20% for EV capable, EV ready, or EV installed spaces? 82% of the folks on the board who took the survey thought that the percentage threshold should stay around 20% for commercial buildings. Well, 18% of you guys thought that, of the folks who took the survey thought that the threshold should go higher. And the suggested percentages that came out of that were 30 and 40%. And then we asked the same exact question, but related to multifamily. And so this one you can see was a little bit more of a split vote. A little more than half of the folks who took the survey thought that the percentage threshold should go higher than 20% in multifamily context. And then the suggested percentages you can see down below, we had everywhere from 30% to 50% of those spaces should be allocated. So this is just to give you guys a sense of where your fellow board members might be at as we lend ourselves into the discussion, because there's a lot to talk about. So now I'm going to walk through the 2024 IECC code language as it relates to the quantity allocation discussion for commercial and multifamily buildings. They basically have it determined by a table that I'll pull up in a couple of slides that say, depending on the occupancy type of your building, this is the percentage EV capable, EV ready, and EV installed spaces that you must have. And then the R2, for R2 buildings, the requirements are based on the total number of dwelling units or parking spaces, whichever is less, so that the percentage threshold might be based on a different number, depending on if dwelling units or parking spaces is higher. And then this is, in addition, in this code language, talks about quantity. So basically, where this number one point is saying that if there's more than one parking facility per building, you have to calculate the EV ready, EV capable, EV installed spaces for both of those parking facilities. The second point there is saying if there's one parking facility that serves multiple occupancy types, you average the occupancy type based on floor area. Number 3 and number 4 get to that substitution piece. So number 3 says if you exceed the number of EV installed equipment spaces, that can contribute to your requirements for EV ready or EV capable. If you exceed the number 4 is if you exceed the number of EV ready spaces that you need, that can contribute towards your EV capable space requirement. Number 5, where EV ready spaces for R2 is equal to the dwelling units or the total parking spaces, the EV supply equipment installation space requirements shall not apply. Yeah, Adam.
Did you get through all 6 of these? I wanted to let you get through this before.
Oh, okay, one more. And then the requirements for group S2, and S2 is is defined in the IBC as the low hazard storage occupancy. It includes public parking garages that are open or enclosed. So really, I think number 6 here is talking about public parking garages. So if there's a public parking garage, the space allocation is determined by the occupancy types that parking garage serves. And if it doesn't serve a specific occupancy type, you use the table that I'll show in the next slide. Adam, and then I'll go to Tim.
Yeah, so I just wanted to make a note, if you can go to the previous slide really quick, in case folks were wondering why the exception was crossed out. So this is the exception that currently exists in the proposed language for the IECC, and I just wanted to note that the state statute does not say that there are any buildings, regardless of number of parking spaces or size, that are multifamily or commercial that do not have to have EV ready or EV capable or EV SE installed requirements. So the board essentially, because of the statute's language, does not have the authority to remove the requirements regardless of building size. So I just wanted to point out in case folks were curious as to why that was crossed out.
Yep, thank you, Adam. I did miss that. Crossed it out in the slide, crossed it out in my mind. Tim, I'll pass it over to you.
Yeah, thanks, Kim. Can you, on the next slide, which had the 6 items, can you go into some detail to explain number 2 and then, of course, number 6? They're hand in hand with the shared parking facilities. How does that work? Let's just say you had 5 buildings with all different square footages and a parking lot with 200 spaces. So the 20% rule would kick in. Do you break up the 20% proportionally based on the total square footage and then the size of the buildings and get them in front of each building?
So if anyone on the board has experience in calculating these averages, please feel free to jump in. I'll just move us ahead to this slide. So my understanding, Tim, is that let's say you had a group A, a group B, and a group F, all being served by the same parking facility. You would take the average, well, I guess I've never tried to explain it before. My guess is you'd have to take the, maybe I'll have to follow up on that. Kevin, I was wondering, hoping someone on the board has done this calculation before.
Oh, we have, yes. And the only thing that strikes me, if you could go back to the previous slide, is they say floor area. So occupancies are determined on an occupant per square foot type of basis. Read that again, based on the floor area of each occupancy. Feels like it'd almost be better than the park, for it to say the parking required, but the parking required is derived from the area. So Tim, say you had, a 500 car parking structure and it serves a 300,000 square foot office building and a 150 room hotel and 200 residences, it would just be proportionate. So the hotel is going to require a number of spaces, the offices and the residences. Usually that's just taken, you say, okay, this percentage of each, the 20% or the 30%, whatever it is, of each of those requirements is what's required. Where it gets messy, and I don't think the legislation can get into this, is these parking structures are often segregated in terms of who uses what areas. And I don't know if this board wants to get into that, of how you define that, because if you said, 20% of the residential, 20% of the commercial, I guess that dictates where the EV spaces are allocated or in the garage. That seems to make the most sense. You want to have it proportionate to each use as it goes.
Yeah, I guess,
So
I'm sorry, go ahead.
Oh, no, go ahead.
So my scenario, really, the question is, and we get quite a few of these multiple retail strip centers sharing a big parking lot in the middle. And so they're all, M occupancies or A, maybe some A's thrown in and B's. So if you had really distinct separate occupancies, like you were saying, Kevin, like a hotel or sharing retail or office or something like that, I think that, to me, pretty straightforward, but it's more of the similar type occupancies sharing and how that gets distributed, or if you have some of the office build or some of the retail buildings 2-story, so you've got double up on the square footages.
Yeah, maybe just using the code, the fact that it points back to occupancies, a code defined occupancy of R2 or whatever. I guess that helps you not have to worry about that distinction, because it just says all the M occupancies are this, and you take 20% of those M occupancies.
Thanks, Kevin. Thanks, Tim. And I think, Tim, as the board has also yet to make a decision on if we want to use an occupancy model or total parking space model. And so maybe there's, that will get resolved through that discussion as well. Rob, and then Adam, if you had something to add.
Hey, sorry. A quick question rooted in my ignorance of commercial spaces. Can someone help me with the definition of a parking facility? Does a blacktop slab outside of a Target constitute a parking facility, or does there have to be some sort of improvement upon, like, does it have to have like a structure on it for it to be considered a parking facility? I'm just coming at this from a place of ignorance.
Yeah, that's a good question, Rob. My understanding is that it's any lot or structure that serves parking. And Ron, do you have a definition?
It was actually a comment about the previous piece of this. I think Rob's question is a good question as to when a parking spot actually becomes a parking spot. I think we would end up having to go back to the land use code within a given jurisdiction to tell us that. But I was just going to comment on the previous discussion about occupancy and all the complications that come up from that. And that's why I was advocating for just a total number of spots model, because it avoids that, especially the confusion that could happen as occupancies change over time. That it just seems like it gets really messy quick. And if we just regulate based upon the total number of spots, it keeps things really understandable.
Thanks, Ron. I'm Adam and then Kevin.
Yeah, I just wanted to agree with what Ron said about the complexity. And I think the only stipulation I'd add to that is I do think that there perhaps is a value in differentiating between multifamily and commercial, just because I think that the needs for multifamily and commercial are going to be significantly different. And so I agree that perhaps it would be very complex and overly complex to perhaps break it down by all occupancy types, but perhaps in a more simple manner to just break it down between multifamily housing and commercial occupancies. And I think that was part of what Kim was getting at with the second option was, kind of a combination of the two. And it sounded like there was some interest and support for that as well. So I just wanted to echo Ron's point and advocate for a slightly altered version of that.
Thanks, Adam. Kevin?
Yeah, so this was similar to why I said just go on percentage of spaces that are there. I think it thins down some of the complexity of that. Just in answering the poll, I think you do have to consider like access control and all of that. Again, I don't think the code and the board shouldn't be getting into that level. But that was my rationale behind saying 20% only or whatever the percentage is. Also, I think hopefully we start to see parking minimums or parking maximums from some municipalities, and that could put you to the point where your total number of spaces is less than the code required amount, or an occupancy based on building code versus zoning code. I don't know if they said that clearly. You could have more code required spaces from an area-based, occupancy-based calculation than the zoning code might have. So I wouldn't want to unfairly burden a number of spaces. Say if the building by occupancy alone needs 250 spaces, but the zoning code only allows 150, the percentage should be applied to that 150, if that makes sense.
Yeah, thanks, Kevin. That does make sense. Tim?
Yeah, I'm in I was in the vote for just going by the total spaces. But with that being said, I think it would be important to probably have some kind of language in terms of how you distribute those, so you don't have with the shared lot or a shared parking facility, so you don't just put them all into one corner and you have 6 buildings surrounding a center parking garage. And plus the accessibility requirements for an IBC require all the EV parking spaces to be van accessible, 8 foot wide.
Yeah, thanks, Tim. Okay. Well, you guys have already kind of started to dive into the discussion that I was going to bring up. Just to wrap up the 2024 code language. Again, this is how this is the breakdown, and they go by occupancy type. And it sounds like we're leaning away from this model, but just to show you guys how the 2024 code landed, and I'm happy to move back to this slide. So within the state of Colorado, as you guys will recall from meeting number 4, 4 of our let's start in the middle. 7 of our communities that have EV ready codes already have them based on the total parking count, and 5 more communities have them based on the total parking count, but split out between multifamily and the rest of commercial buildings. There are 4 communities within the state that use the percentages or allocate percentages based on occupancies in the IBC or other building type identifications that they've done within their own municipal codes. So I have slides detailing all of the space allocation percentages from each of the communities that we shared in meeting 4. But I'm curious, before we muddy the waters with all of the different various and sundry options that exist, if we want to pause here and just kind of jump into a discussion on any other thoughts on how we allocate spaces, which of these 3 options we go with, and then maybe start with commercial. How do we want to approach the space allocation with the feedback from the board's survey responses being that most folks think we should keep it around 20%. Or I'm happy to walk through the code options. But Carolyn.
Yeah, so I will offer some perspective on why we combined the 2 and why I responded the way I did in my survey response. Under land use code, we define and specify what minimum number of spaces are based on zoning and building requirements. And so that sets, and as we just had the discussion, and it's tied to occupancy of those buildings and the number of vehicles that would reasonably be expected. Right. And so that's where the number of parking spaces up front gets defined. And since that is tied to occupancy, we can reasonably expect it to also be tied to vehicles that are there, which would then also be tied to charging needs for those occupants. So that's where the percentage of spaces comes into play. But then how charging occurs at those sites will vary depending on what that building's purpose is. And so we advocate, and I advocate for Group R having a higher proportional allocation because of the duration and number of cars that reside in those spaces. These are places where cars are parked overnight or for extended periods of time. We also know that most people find it most convenient to be able to charge at home or where they're otherwise staying for a period of time, which is very different than, say, going into a workplace, whether that's an office building or a mall. People, unless they're working there, are spending less time in those spaces. And so the charging needs are a little bit different. So that's why we combined the 2 in the case of Boulder. And that's certainly, I think, consistent with some of the comments we've also seen from the public that are really advocating for us to take a harder look at like multifamily housing and hotels specifically, as well as what Denver provided us in terms of their allocations and comments. So that's where I would start from.
Thank you, Carolyn. Does anybody else want to share their thoughts on space allocation based on one of these 3 models? Adam, and then Jason.
I'll let Jason go first. I was just wondering if perhaps it would be interesting, once everyone's had the opportunity to make their argument, if we wanted to do kind of a, show of hands essentially of folks, in each camp, just to see where, after the arguments have been made and folks have had time to think about it, if that would be an interesting way of proceeding. Just to get a sense, if everyone is feeling, if the arguments were persuasive or anything about getting folks into one camp or another.
Yeah, thanks, Adam. I think that's a great suggestion. Jason.
I just want to echo what Carolyn said. I think it's really important to be able to offer more charging availability in multifamily where cars are parked. And I think it's going to be increasingly a social justice issue as well. And so I'd strongly advocate for increasing the multifamily above 20%. And then, thinking about use types and fast charging, I think focusing fast charging in places that have that quicker turnaround and as opposed to multifamily and allowing that to maybe offset some of the other EV ready requirements or number allocation. I think that's also important. So.
Yeah, thanks, Jason. Dawn.
I'm going to kind of go a little bit the opposite way and suggest we kind of stick with the 20%, and then let these jurisdictions, if they feel that they need to increase it in their jurisdiction, they have that ability to do so. I'm just thinking about the communities I'm representing on this board, and looking at some of the lists here of the communities that have the higher requirements. Most of these communities, they wish they had the financial problems of these communities. There are a lot of poorer communities that, we're just doing everything we can to try to get buildings filled, doing everything we can to get any type of housing built at all. And I just want to make sure that we're not putting up deterrents. I've got no problem with the 20%. I just think we need to be careful that not everybody falls into this camp.
Yeah, thank you, Don. Lauren, I'll pass it to you.
Thanks. I just had a question. So I'm not as well versed certainly on the technical side, but I was curious if does anyone have sort of thoughts or experience in terms of how these different models impact affordable housing? So I've just been thinking a lot about whether it's multifamily rental or multifamily in a condo ownership context. If anyone's had experience with, sort of how the usage gets dispersed across different occupancies, or how it impacts like HOA costs for a multifamily development like that. And just kind of thinking about, the balance between that upfront cost, but also not wanting to exclude lower to moderate income households that may be living in affordable housing from obviously having access to what I think is, is the future, and certainly wanting to have equity around that. So I'm just curious if any of the folks from different jurisdictions have had any experience with that.
Yeah, thanks. And Elizabeth, I don't know if you wanted to jump in or if you had a separate comment.
Yeah, it's actually, Lauren, your comment was key, because I was trying to formulate a comment on affordable housing. So we do a lot of affordable housing work in all jurisdictions. And usually when I'm talking about affordable housing, we mean those that are a percentage below the area median income, such that they're targeting federal tax credits. And the projects that are targeting the low income housing tax credit financing do have certain electric vehicle charging requirements that have to be met as a part of their financing requirements. We have projects in, affordable housing projects in Denver and other jurisdictions that have EV charging requirements above and beyond what CHFA already requires. So CHFA is the Colorado Housing Financing Authority, and it is a significant financial burden just to provide all the conduit, for example, of all of the EV capable spaces that Denver requires. I was just on a call with a project yesterday, so I happen to have this figure handy. It was an extra $300,000 for a 70 unit affordable housing project. So that's not insignificant, especially since most of their residents don't own cars at all. So I think it would be a consideration for projects that do have a percentage of AMI units, that those units could potentially be excluded or accounted for in a different way, because it is a different demographic than a typical R2 occupancy. And there already are some EV charging requirements if you're a tax credit project. So I think that's a valid concern. My other comment was if I can keep going, or I'll turn it back and take a different turn.
No. Please feel free to add your second comment, Elizabeth.
I was going to echo. I think it was Carolyn who suggested or was promoting the percentage of things be based on occupancy, and I do strongly agree with that as well. And the charging needs when you're charging overnight are at your home are going to be different if you're stopping by an office or a mall and you want a quick charge. So I think that we would want to consider those differently, as well as how that does impact the grid and stuff like that. Like you may not need more, what we might consider superchargers in an R2 as we might in different places where you want that quick charge.
Thanks, Elizabeth. Rob, and then we'll continue down with Rick and Tim.
Sure. So I'm inclined to agree with the point about setting a fixed percentage, making sure that we keep in mind that keep our objectives focused on setting statewide minimums and making sure that communities know they can go further than that. I don't know if it's within scope of our discussion right now, but discussions around affordability and equity, is it within our, it's probably not within our scope, but what about the exclusivity of parking in some of these EV capable spaces? That's something that I notice when I go, when I'm in different locations, there are EV spaces that are reserved for EV cars. And if there's not a huge market penetration, and where there's lots of parking spaces that go unutilized, is that equitable? Might be beyond our scope. And then the last comment I have is around fast chargers. And I'd like, especially in infill situations where we're replacing, where commercial buildings are being built in places that might have older infrastructure, stuff that's been there for 60, 80, 100 years. We want to make sure that that isn't going to pose any problems for us on the distribution side, to have fast chargers, or even the quantity of chargers is something that the grid can handle. So I'd like the chance to probably connect with our distribution engineers to talk our way through that, because I haven't, between getting the agenda and today's meeting, I didn't have a chance to hook up with any of them and get their opinions on what that might look like.
Yeah, thanks, Rob. Rick, and then Tim.
Thanks, Kim. This is Rick Garcia, the Executive Director of the Department of Local Affairs. Good questions on the affordable housing piece. I felt like I needed to weigh in to some degree. A lot of good points already made, but I'll just mention that in the context of some of the current affordable housing grant and loan programs that are available currently for local jurisdictions, local nonprofits to make application for, the category of affordable housing that falls in permanent supportive housing, which is really lower income individuals, very low income, lower than 80% of the area median income. They are achieving an exemption on EV ready or EV capable locations. And I think there's a good logic for that, because these are typically residents that are not going to own vehicles, and they may be moving beyond the permanent supportive housing environment into other permanent housing, that's perhaps more higher AMI focused. But during the time they're in these other units that are permanent supported housing, there's not a lot of driving that goes on. So I just wanted to put that out there. And then also, when we talk about affordable housing, this has really grown in complexity over the course of the last few years here in our state. In fact, even around the country, the definition of affordability is wide. I think some could argue that even 80%, and that's the typical threshold for federal housing tax credits, is still attainable by many workers. We have some markets in Colorado where our current grant and loan programs that are available through ARPA can achieve in excess of 140% of the area median income. And that means affordability in those markets. So I just want to put that out there for context, because as we talk about affordability, housing affordability, it really is a range, and we need to be cognizant of where one size does not fit all. I guess that's my point. It depends on the market, where it is, what the complexity of the housing cost dynamics are, et cetera. So I just wanted to make a few of those points. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Rick. Tim, I'll pass it to you.
Yeah, thank you, Kim. So I mentioned a comment a little bit ago on the IBC accessibility requirements for EV spaces, and in the 2018 and the 2021 both, and I believe it'll be the same in the 24, you are required to provide at least 5% of the provided EV spaces to meet accessibility. And that would mean 96-inch, 8-foot wide with a 5-foot access aisle next to it. So going above the 20%, 40%, 50%, whatever some of the suggestions were, I think the consideration needs to stay on the table of that potential extra cost for land requirements and the cost for the concrete or asphalt paving that'll go with that many spaces. And, you know, say in a concrete parking garage, you're going to have a lot more width of concrete to be able to accommodate how many parking spaces they need. So I think the board really needs to keep that in mind, that this is an energy code on the state, but the IBC is going to overlay in all the jurisdictions for the most part, 18 on. And so if you 20% is still going to be a hit, 5% of the 20%. But when you get even more, I think that it's going to start increasing costs much beyond just running conduit.
Yeah, thanks, Tim, for that extra perspective. Lauren and then Aaron.
Thanks. So I just wanted to add some to what Rick was saying, just acknowledging that there is that spectrum of affordability. So just from the seat where I represent, which is on the permanent affordable homeownership. So we don't actually have that LIHTC financing mechanism. We are literally working with, you know, as a private public partnership, we are bringing private subsidy and then working with cities and the state, and in some cases, you know, federal dollars. But you know, so we are working with households generally at and below 80% of AMI, but they are becoming homeowners. And so I guess when I was just asking about, you know, the HOA and the equity and even the upfront costs. So even if we're working with a developer partner that is having to include upfront costs, that is really coming to us in just an increased gap in terms of the funding that we have to find to be able to put a permanent subsidy in those homes in the community land trust model to make them affordable to those income ranges. But I do think there needs to be some balance, because I also don't feel like the right answer is to you know, not provide the infrastructure that I feel, you know, as time goes on is going to certainly become more and more critical. You know, I don't think the answer is to not provide, you know, those households with the infrastructure that is essentially, you know, sort of for the future. So I guess I just want to reiterate that the homeownership sector on the affordable housing has a really different financing mechanism than the rental side. And just, yeah, wanted to just add that. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you, Lauren. Aaron.
Yeah, just very quickly, because this has been touched on already, but from the affordable housing side of things, I would just want to remind everybody, whether that you have experience or exposure to that sector or not, there can be a default sort of thinking of, well, it's hard to build housing anyway. We're on a shoestring budget. We're trying to close gaps. I would advocate for, you know, a lot of these affordable developments are bound to affordability for 60 or more years. We need to be thinking about the future and not building barriers for low-income people to have access to EV infrastructure, electrification, you know, all of the transitions that we're trying to work on. We need to think about not putting barriers in the way down the road. Yes, not many low-income people have electric cars right now, but we don't want to make it harder for them to transition to that and reap the benefits of those technologies in the future. So again, just a balance, and I wouldn't want to see any unnecessary or misguided exceptions for affordable housing where the infrastructure and the investments wouldn't be made into those developments.
Yeah, thank you, Aaron. So just a couple of comments that popped into the chat. Jason shared, I appreciate Denver's exception to requiring the minimum KVA 6.2 if an energy management system is provided in multifamily. And Carolyn agrees, and that would basically just means there's a lower minimum capacity for those chargers if it's provided in multifamily, meaning less power might need to be pulled for each one of those chargers. So I appreciate everyone sharing their thoughts. I think what we might do now, just to kind of temperature check where folks are at, is pose the question to the board of based on everyone's thoughts that they shared, where you guys are leaning as far as space allocation breakdowns, and still looking at these sort of three options with, hearing, with the discussion around affordability, maybe or maybe not added as a like a third split in this final, like in the percentage piece over here, or honestly in any of them. So let's just do a quick raise of hands, just so we can kind of, again, this is we could talk in circles on this forever. So if you would prefer that we have space allocation based on building occupancy types, please raise your hand. Okay. If you would prefer to have percentages based on total parking count only, so not including a breakout up for multifamily, please raise your hand. Okay, thank you guys. Got 5, okay. And then if you would like to see the percentage breakdown happen, be split between our groups and other groups, please raise your hand for this. One, 10. Okay. Okay, so it looks like just by way of majority, it looks like we are falling towards this both option. And so what I'd like to do is go through the communities that have the both code in place, and show you guys what this looks like, and then start to work towards the discussion on what do we want that percentage breakdown to look like, because this number, even though it seems like it could be this, is the number that we really want to get to here in this discussion. So Chris, and then Carolyn, and then we'll move into that review.
Thanks, Kim. And I just wanted to acknowledge the concern we heard from Don and others about this. And I think part of this comes down to, it's not just how we allocate the overarching, that there has to be some EV requirement. Some of this will come down to how we distribute the EVSE requirement, the ready and the capable requirement, and then this other conversation that happened in the chat around whether we're fixing allowing for concessions around the service capacity needs. So I don't want to dismiss the concern we heard, even though we definitely voted in favor of blending it. I think that the devil can be in the details on how we accommodate some of those concerns. So I just wanted to offer that up, just out of respect for those who I think offered some very strong and important positions here.
Yeah, I really appreciate that, Carolyn. And I do want to say that vote was not what I would consider an official board vote. That was more of just a straw poll to understand where you guys were leaning, so we can focus in the rest of the discussion. So I agree with Carolyn's points that we can try to work out some of those details on making sure we're being supportive of the low income or developments or communities that might not be able to push the threshold beyond 20%, and consider that as we assign the percentages for each space type. So I'm just going to move through. So here are the couple of examples that have it split by both. And so I'll take a look at these, and then we'll kind of offer open up the discussion to see where folks want to land with this. So City of Boulder has the Group R occupancy requirements. 1 to 25 spaces is 1 EV ready space per dwelling unit. If there's 25 or more spaces, it's 10% EV ready per dwelling unit, and 40% of remaining spaces should be EV capable, and 5% of those spaces should be EV installed. For all other building occupancy types, for if there's 1 space, it must be EV ready. If there's 2 to 25 spaces, you have to have 1 EV ready, 1 EV capable space. 25 and plus spaces is 10 EV ready, 10% EV ready, 10% EV capable, and then 5% EV installed. City of Boulder also has the language written within their code that an EV supply equipment installed space may reduce by up to 5 if 1 or more level 3 chargers and EV ready spaces are included. So the substitution language. So the city of Broomfield has 2 parking or percentage breakdowns. So this is for non-residential development. Again, they split it by non-residential and residential. So it's divvied up by the total amount of parking provided, and you can see EV capable, EV ready, and EV installed spaces here for Broomfield. And then this is what it looks like for their multifamily residential development. It's pretty similar with a couple of changes between the 2 versions. And then looking at Dillon, Lafayette, and Superior, for Dillon, for Group R occupancies, again, we have that 2 to 9 spaces have a certain requirement, 10 plus spaces have additional requirements, and then for Group R, and then for all other occupancies, you have a similar breakdown based on the number of spaces. For Lafayette, for commercial, you have to have 5% EV ready, 10% EV capable, 2% EV installed. For multifamily, they separate it out as 2 spaces or 10%, whichever is greater, must be EV ready, and 20% must be EV capable. And then for Superior, you can see the commercial and the multifamily breakdown there. Lafayette and Superior both say that number of EV capable spaces can be reduced by up to 4 for each additional EV ready space provided. So again, allowing for some of that substitution. Adam.
I think it's important to note that I think just based on what the statute says, we need to be careful that if we do weigh into this, substitution conversation, that 20% of the spaces still need to be covered by something. So, for example, if an EVSE space takes 5, is able to be replace 5 EV ready spaces, we have to accommodate that for that, by an increase in capable or something else to make sure that 20% of spaces are still covered.
Thanks, Adam. So I guess the first question that I'll pose to the board, as you can see within the space allocations for both, these percentages kind of are broken down by the number of parking spaces provided. And we see that in Broomfield, we see that in City of Boulder, we see that in all of these, in Dillon, and then we don't necessarily see that in Lafayette or Superior. So in the board's opinion, would love to open the floor and hear thoughts on this. Do we think within the space allocation, we want to break it down to the level of number of parking spaces, or keep it as Lafayette and Superior did, speaking just to percentages, irregardless of the number of spaces provided? And it's a big question, so I'll give you guys a moment to think. And if there's a slide that would be better for me to move to, I'm happy to do that. Carolyn.
Yeah, I just offer, I think as possibly we started this in Boulder, but I think it's the nuance here is really the actual charging installations that I think folks are seeking to get at with the distinction and how many parking spaces are there, as to whether that investment needs to be made to actually install the charging station itself, rather than the other 2 space types, which are the EV ready and EV capable. So I think that's the nuance I just want to note there.
Yeah, thanks, Carolyn.
Can you go back to Boulder's description?
Yeah, absolutely. Oh, go for it, Ron.
I'm just curious if somebody could maybe articulate what the downside is of doing a straight percentage.
So I was just noting the only thing we intended to be different in ours was if you had a small lot, whether or not you had to install a charging station itself. So the EVSE requirement specifically. I think, and then whether the EV capable needed to be included in as well for those small lots. That was only our intent. I don't have a strong feeling that I have to advocate for that, but that was the intent of acknowledging that at a smaller building with a smaller lot, then we didn't necessarily want to make the parking infrastructure the most expensive thing.
Thanks, Carolyn. Ron, did you have another thought or question?
I'm good. Thank you.
Adam and then Don.
I mean, I think that I would advocate for percentages across the board. I think for one main reason is consistency with the statute and making it really clear that certain things meet the statutory requirements, because numbers out of a particular number of spaces, you know, one space out of 4 is 25%, but one space out of 25 is not. So, you know, I think that makes it really difficult to make it clear that the statute is being met if you don't do it in a percentage way and if you do it in a number-based format. So that's one point that I would raise as to why I would advocate for percentages across the board.
Thanks, Adam. Don?
You know, maybe somebody out there can answer this question, how they've dealt with this, but, you know, I'm thinking of the multi-use parking, you know, where you see different entities combine because we know how expensive parking is. They combine to try to help save on cost. How are we gonna allocate those out?
Yeah, Don, great question. And I think what we're looking at right now is, rather than designating allocation based on who's using that parking, just setting a percentage standard that every parking facility, no matter what, except for if you're a residential occupancy type, which we can talk about in a moment, has to comply with. So if it's you know, serving multiple occupancies, it would be the same percentage no matter what. Or if it's serving one occupancy, it would be that same percentage allocation. Tim?
Yeah, thanks, Kim. For just clarity, if you could remind me, we know that language says 20%, and I know the discussion's been back and forth, does that increase? But we are also charged with how many of that 20% number would be EV ready, EV capable, and EFSC, correct? So we got to do kind of the sub breakup. Is that also part of what we're talking about right now or discussion?
Yeah, thanks for bringing that up, Tim. It is where we're headed. Absolutely. I think I was trying to get a sense from the board if we would want to include the level of detail that dictates you know, those percentages might, like, that they change based on the number of parking spaces. Adam perspective that he shared is that it should be the same across the board, no matter what. And so maybe, you know, would love to continue to hear thoughts on that. But to Tim's point, maybe it would make sense to move to discussing of that 20%, knowing that that's the minimum state standard we need to reach, at least for the commercial multifamily. and maybe we start with commercial so we can have the multifamily conversation next. What percentage breakdown of those space types would be amenable to the board? So it can be, 15% EV capable, 2% EV ready, 3% EV installed. Any breakdown within that 20% of those three space types. Adam?
I guess I'm just wondering, can we perhaps frame this in what, since the board seemed to indicate that there was probably the majority interest was moving forward with our occupancies separate from commercial. I think it'd be important to talk about this in the context of how do we feel about this for commercial, and then separately, how do we feel about this for multifamily? So yeah, I think it would be important just to approach it that way too.
Absolutely. And sorry if I didn't make that clear, thinking maybe we start the conversation here with commercial, not multifamily, for that space breakdown. And I know I'll just share that I know it feels a little bit like we're kind of throwing, could maybe feel like a little bit like we're throwing things at the wall to see what sticks. But if any jurisdictions have experience in the breakdown that they provided with or put in place for commercial buildings, maybe we can start there. Or if anyone has a general leaning on how many installed spaces we want versus capable versus ready, it can even be as simple as we want a majority EV capable, only 1 or 2 EV installed. All of any type of comments or context like that will help us sort of dial in the code language itself. So even though it might feel a little hard to determine what those exact percentages should be, I'd encourage everyone to share their thoughts on their general leanings of the breakdown. So we can go back and refine those numbers.
I'd also encourage Kevin and any others from the client side who have experience on what clients expect. That might be helpful also.
Yeah, Kevin.
Yeah, thanks. I started typing this in the chat. I realized it wasn't making sense. There's an element of market correction to this. For the number, and so like if the requirements feel too low, we do see instances of developers saying, I understand that's the requirement, but my market study shows that I'm going to need more than this, so they'll exceed. I don't see municipalities putting thresholds that are so high that people are resisting that. There's some cost, and there's current concerns most readily in Denver right now because the newly adopted code actually scaled back a little bit. So I think they're saying like maybe the first version in 2019 code was a little bit of an overreach. 2022 is changing some of that. So there's little tweaks in there. I'll see if I can find some of the resources that explain that. We've assembled them in our office recently, shared. And then back to the affordable conversation a while ago, that we do see a lot of times parking reductions are pretty prevalent. So it's a little bit why I was advocating for the straight percentages, because I think affordable housing inherently will have parking reductions already built into it. So you're still providing a percentage of that, and market rate, they may already be pushing. So if they need 100 by code, but they want to provide 125, they're going to have that percentage provided 125 instead. So allowing the market to correct for things is a sketchy thing to do when considering a code, but it does exist, just for context.
Thanks, Kevin. Elizabeth?
Yeah, I'll echo that. Like for multifamily and commercial, I'd say that EV charging is the new amenity. So there is definitely a market-driven aspect to that. There could also be an advantage into keeping the state requirement fairly low as far as the, whether EV ready, EV capable, whatever, to keep that low as the group is comfortable, only because the reason for that is most of our rebates and incentives and tax credits and everything are based on doing things that are above and beyond the code. So like, for example, Excel, and even like the ChargePoint grant, there's tons of rebates out there for anything that you do above and beyond what you're already required to do. So it's very possible that we can make it more affordable more prevalent for people by playing on the available funding that's out there.
Thanks, Elizabeth. I wonder if I could put you on the spot since you're the last one to speak. If you want to maybe throw out some suggestion around how that, like, keeping the requirements low might look as far as the allocation for capable, ready, and installed.
Yeah, I think being mindful of cost, and we're setting the bar for our most underserved districts and zones, and that the Boulders and the Denvers are likely going to have local amendments that go above and beyond our state requirements. But by keeping the state code, yes, I definitely want this infrastructure to happen, but I also want people to be able to fund it. And being mindful of that, the percentage could be more on the lower end of first cost. And that then as soon as you've kind of got some of that infrastructure built in, that then the market can drive some of the actual installed equipment. And then the purchasers of those installed equipment will have a lot more options for making that more affordable. So as far as numbers, I hadn't thought that far, but I would try to keep it to what is the sweet spot from a cost standpoint, where we're getting that infrastructure, but then keeping the door open for people to tap into funding to get the actual chargers installed.
Great, thank you, Elizabeth. So I'm, by way of understanding the materials and requirements that would go into EV capable and EV ready, just keep in mind per state statute, the difference between those two is that the EV ready has the raceway, the actual wiring, and it ends in a receptacle or outlet where it could be more of a plug and play with the EV charger. And EV capable just requires the conduit and the panel capacity, so it doesn't require the wiring in the raceway to be run to the outlet itself. Adam, and then Carolyn.
Thanks. I will say that I hear what Elizabeth is saying. I think that she raises a valid point. I think my concern with setting a really low statewide minimum and then just relying on jurisdictions or the market to drive that up is that you are going to see a really inequitable distribution of how that will progress over time. I think I forgot who it was, maybe Aaron said it earlier about specifically relating to affordable housing, but I think that this goes broader to cover rural areas, to cover traditionally disadvantaged communities, and that my concern with having really low bar is that you're going to have all of the really the jurisdictions that would be inclined to go well above are going to be the ones who do so, and it's going to somewhat leave the other jurisdictions and the people and the projects within those jurisdictions behind. So that would be my concern with just really trying to track the minimum that the statute requires, is that we will really end up in a situation where communities like Denver and Boulder and Fort Collins are going to have a lot more equitable opportunities for EV charging infrastructure, and other communities that are not within those areas will not.
Thanks, Adam. Carolyn, and then I'll go to Don.
Yeah, I think what's helpful when we think about this is going back to the conversation we had in Solar Ready, which is the cost of retrofit and how we mitigate that. And that's the intent behind EV capable, more so than EV ready. So if you're putting in the raceway and you have the service capacity at the site, it is much more cost effective to come back in and wire it and terminate. And I think that gives greater flexibility to building owners. So I tend to agree with Adam here in that I want to keep the equity piece centered, also acknowledging that there's or we may want to center that around the most cost effective or mitigation strategy we have. And so I wouldn't want to sacrifice on the capable component of that. I think that's much more important than for example, actually installing those chargers at time of construction. So walking that line. So that would be my position.
Yeah, and I would absolutely agree with that perspective.
Thanks, Carolyn. Don.
Yes, thank you. I totally agree with Carolyn. The capability, being capable is one thing that is very important, but I'm going to disagree with Adam. When it comes to trying to force a situation of equity, you can't squeeze blood from a turnip. And if the money's not there to make it happen, it's not going to happen. So we got to be careful how hard we want to push the equity thing.
Thanks, Don. So generally from the folks who have spoken so far, I'm hearing that we want to maybe center the majority of our space allocation on EV capable, understanding that is the most cost-effective way of including EV ready infrastructure without actually needing the install, so that the retrofits are very cost-effective later on. And I think that's fantastic. I am curious how folks feel about a requirement for the actual install of charging, and if that should be one of the spaces or the percentages allocated as we develop this code. And again, thinking just for commercial for this conversation. And maybe a cleaner way of saying that is, do we want to require EV supply equipment be installed as part of the minimum code standard?
I will start us out with yes.
Thanks, Carolyn.
I would also say yes.
I'll agree as well.
As do I.
Okay.
Zachary as well here. I say yes also.
Okay. Thank you guys. That's helpful. So I'm thinking about the percentages here. Maybe we lean heaviest on EV capable. I'm not sure, well, and I'll open up the floor too, if anyone wants to advocate for EV ready, and then having a smaller percentage of allocation assigned to actual installed equipment. Does anyone want to throw their hat in the ring for why we should be including EV ready as one of the space allocations for the minimum standard?
Throw my hat in the ring advocating for some level of EV ready. Again, while acknowledging that the cost of retrofit is smaller for EV ready, I still think that if the building isn't ready, the barriers are significant. And so there should be some percentage of spaces that need to be easily accommodated, balancing that against what the long term is. And so thinking, today, if EVs are X percent of our fleet and we have state targets that would put them towards Y, and this code's going to affect that, we want to be somewhere in the ballpark of supporting what people might adopt without stranding EV ready investment now ahead of when that adoption might occur. So that's the trade-off I would argue for.
Okay, thanks, Carolyn. Kevin and then Elizabeth.
Thanks. I'd echo Carolyn's sentiment, maybe for a separate reason, is that having the infrastructure in place for that, but not having to go fully EVSE installed, potentially could result in a long-term cost savings that as these chargers become more prevalent, the cost could go down. Having the infrastructure there to be able to place maybe the less expensive actual charging unit in the future could be a benefit. And if the infrastructure is not there, I think that could be a detriment or a hindrance to actually having them installed.
Okay, thanks, Kevin. Elizabeth.
Yeah, we may want to look at EV ready for R2 type of occupancy differently from the rest of commercial, only because EV ready is very perfectly fine for an overnight charging type of situation. So where, you know, an EV ready may not be as useful in, say, an office building parking lot, they could be really useful in a multifamily parking garage.
Sorry, quick question. Is that just because of the volt outlet requirement associated with the terminology we're using, Elizabeth?
Yeah, it's to do with the electrical people don't throw things at me, but it has something to do with the amperage and the speed at which you can charge. Like, I'm a new EV vehicle owner here, and I'm still charging on my regular old 120 volt outlet, and it's serving me just fine. I have plans to install a 208 volt, but I can get around town on less than what EV ready requires. So I think there could be some minimal investment here that can push someone in a multifamily lot, say, over the hump in their choice to purchase an electric vehicle.
Thanks, Elizabeth. Cody.
Yeah, if we're going to do an EV ready requirement, I would encourage us to keep that threshold low or that bar low. Same reason with some of the reasons that Don made on the EV capable, as well as keeping that low. I understand the equity piece, but I also want to make sure we've got a lot of rural communities here in Mesa County. What I want to make sure we don't do is disincentivize investment in these areas, because we've created a floor that's too high. So, and maybe we can continue to recognize that we are creating a floor and not a ceiling. And so I think we need to find balance between both of those kind of polar ends.
Thanks, Cody. And just to clarify and remind everyone, the minimum percentage for all three space types we have to hit per state statute is 20%. So that is, I think, the floor that we're discussing for commercial, and within that 20%, which of those spaces go to which space type? Carolyn.
Yeah, well, first a correction. I think there is some advocacy to go above the 20% minimum in the R buildings. So yes. I wanted to just ask Cody a question. Do you see a distinction between, say, a 20% and a 40% EV capable? So that's solely the conduit and then the service capacity being a deterrent, or is it more in the ready space? So can you maybe help us quantify that concern a little bit of where you see kind of those thresholds?
Yeah, I would like to go more heavy on the EV capable, obviously, because then you're not running the wire and all that stuff, but the infrastructure is still there to run in the future. But I would still advocate towards closer to the 20%, and most of that being EV capable. If we do want to add in the EV ready, I say we still keep it small in terms of that 20% threshold. Does that answer your question, Carolyn?
It does. If we were to, I want to see where we can get you comfortable. I think 20% may be insufficient, because again, when we talk about conduit, like placing it at the time the lot is constructed is so much easier than having to come back. And so, and it's a limited investment. So the incremental cost is on the service capacity, really, when we talk about this. And I'd like to advocate for the 40% number for multifamily and our class. Like, I'd like to advocate for where we are in terms of total spacing, with the majority of that being EV capable. I definitely can support fewer on the EV ready. And I just wanted to see how you respond to that and kind of where you're at if I put that out there.
Yeah, and I get that. Again, we're creating a floor, and I understand you with a floor. I would just advocate for a lower floor. So, but I get it. It's much easier to put in the conduit early than it is later. I've gone in and put ripped out concrete and put in conduit later. It's expensive. It's time consuming, labor intensive. So I get that, but I'm still going to advocate for the closer to the 20% on the EV capable.
Thank you. Appreciate it.
Thank you, guys. Tim.
Yeah, thank you. I'm going down the path of agreeing that I think the vast majority should be EV capable. I've reached out to Mike just now to my contact with International Code Council to find out if an EV capable space would also have to comply with the size requirements in the IBC. When I get that answer back, I'll let the group know. with that being said, on the EV capable, there's nothing in the statute that says they ever have to be actually converted into an EV ready. So running the conduit and then just having it stubbed up and capped does certainly save a lot of the infrastructure costs in the beginning, but then there's nothing anywhere that's going to require those to actually end up being usable. Would that be correct, the way I read that language?
Adam, I don't know if you want to respond directly to that, or Kevin, if you had an interpretation as well.
Yeah, I do think it's the most cost accessible because, reading that slide again, it's panel capacity. It doesn't even have to include the breakers. It's just panel capacity, I believe, the branch circuit and raceway. So maybe if there's somebody on the electrical side and that can clarify the electric panel capacity and conduit. Okay. Yeah.
So I think, again, the key differences here is the conduit needs to be run and the panel capacity needs to be in place. The raceway wiring, the receptacle that it ends in the circuit overprotection device, or the components that would make it an EV ready space. So you're actually running the wire from the panel to the outlet itself, and making sure that outlet is grounded.
And I'm just trying to balance that sensitivity about the cost barrier and raising that too high. I was glancing at Denver's code, and they went that way with the R1, R2, and R2, R1 is 40% EV capable. And I think their intent in that was you're making room for it, but you're not having to buy all that infrastructure. And I absolutely understand that you can't apply a Denver metric to Mesa or anywhere else in the state. But I do think in doing so, it's the least cost impact to have a capable. And then it also gives you room for it to be implemented later on.
Thanks, Kevin. Adam?
I had 2 points. First, I wanted to sort of address what Tim was asking. Tim, I think you're correct in saying that there's nothing that's going to require, nothing today that's going to require them to go back and install an EV, either, install the wiring or the receptacle or the charger itself today. I think we also have to think down the line about, as cities and the state, look into building performance standards and other standards for existing buildings, that there is certainly the possibility that those requirements for existing buildings will certainly come down the line. And I think, my other point was really, I agree with what, Kevin and Carolyn and others are saying about, I think one of the main things that this board is really tasked with is kind of trying to find that sweet spot between offsetting the upfront costs between the future retrofit costs. And it sounds, based on what everyone is saying, it sounds to me really like that there is a lot of agreement that, the conduit and the installation of the conduit and the panel capacity at new construction is really one of the biggest steps to offsetting those future retrofit costs. The wiring is one thing, the receptacles is one thing, but the real offset of those future retrofit costs is going to come from that initial infrastructure that's going in during new construction to make the space for all of these future improvements. And so I think, to me, when we're thinking about, that the state is has one of the highest rates of adoption of electric vehicles in the entire country, and that rate is only going to increase over time and is increasing rapidly from year to year already. I think we really have to be thinking about what is going to help offset those future retrofit costs as we approach that future where EVs are so, become the majority and probably at some point become the only sale of vehicles, and really how we can offset those future retrofit costs in a future that looks like that. And so I think that the point, I would agree very much with the point about, going really heavy on EV capable, perhaps preparing, including some EVSE installed for the infrastructure or for the, vehicles that exist and are on the road today and that are going to be on the road in the next couple of years. A little bit of this space is reserved for EV ready, so that, as that infrastructure is starting to grow in a more exponential way, we have more of that infrastructure in place for, chargers to be installed more easily. But then, really just that last step is, what can we do to offset that future cost for folks who are looking out into the longer term? We're looking out in the next 30, 40, 50 years as that kind of transition to EVs is going to be taking place. And especially in multifamily housing, I think we have to acknowledge that as that transition is going to be taking place, there are going to be a lot of spaces that are needed for EVs, and recognizing that if we can have a relatively low upfront cost from EV capable now, recognizing that that's the direction that the state and the country is going, then I think that really makes sense to kind of go all in on the EV capable side and relatively smaller on the EV ready and EVSE installed now. So that's my perspective.
Thank you, Adam. We'll go Tim, Elizabeth, and then Lauren.
Sorry about that. I was on a different screen. One comment I have, and part of the discussion, at least on the multifamily side, that we might have to get worked out is we've got a number of multifamily projects that have attached garages that go to some of the units. And some buildings, we even have like garages that are on the first floor and they're out just basically for lease. So for distribution of the R2 EV capable or EV ready, whichever that is, goes back to how that works, because some of these apartment projects, well, all of the ones that we have here in Broomfield that have that condition or set up, they also have the site parking to go along with that. So I'm not sure how that would kind of come into play with distribution, back to how do we distribute this 20% number?
Thanks, Tim. Elizabeth?
Yeah, just going back to the requirements of EV capable, just so everyone's aware. I mean, we're not talking about just conduit and just physical space in our panel, but by capacity, that does mean that the electrical service has to account for those future loads. So, adding a transformer, upgrading your switchgear, all of those things are included in that cost. So just echo everyone else who said, yes, that's absolutely the hardest thing to upgrade later. It's also the biggest first cost in all of this. So I'm hoping we can find the sweet spot there between what's a good place to start on the capable, because this is not free. It's not just, running conduit's super easy. It's not. There's a significant expense and investment there. However, the delta between EV capable and EV ready is not that big. So, and that's why I've sort of what I was alluding to with the EV ready being considered for, a higher percentage of that for our R2, because once you make that initial investment, it's going to make sense to have that available to use with very little added cost to get to EV ready.
Thanks, Elizabeth. Lauren.
I think Elizabeth actually just pretty much answered one of my questions, which was, does EV capable, get you 80, 90% there, or sort of what is, and maybe it's not that defined of a percentage, but it sounds like if I'm understanding you correctly, Elizabeth, that it's really most of the way there. But I guess that was one of my questions. And then again, I'm sorry, I'm coming from a non-technical background, but just curious on the EV ready, is there any sort of, I guess, industry sort of expectation that infrastructure will support, electric vehicles for the next 5 years, 10 years? I mean, is there any chance that infrastructure, I guess not any chance, but just curious from folks sort of in the industry, if there's a concern that, okay, we don't want to build out too much of the infrastructure in case the technology of the vehicles changes to the extent where this is not any longer the best infrastructure. So.
Yeah, thanks, Lauren. I think that's a fantastic question. I don't have the answer to that, but if anyone on the board wants to respond.
I think the most change has occurred on the fast charging side, so the level 3, not so much in the level 2 or level 1. I mean, that just it's basically treated as an appliance like other appliances. Most of what you're hearing about in terms of standardization is more on how it connects to the vehicle or some of that. So, I mean, I feel like this isn't necessarily stranding investment on the EV ready side at the 208/40 amp side. That would be my take, Brad. You have some experience with this as well.
Yeah, thanks. I can, Lauren, maybe chime in a little bit on that. Certainly, some of the stuff that we're seeing with the Tesla charging recommendation at 50 amp, that doesn't mean that those vehicles can't charge at 40 amp circuits. 40 amp circuit actually gets you a pretty realistic number of hours of charge. So I think it's realistic to probably say that as a minimum, that'll probably be a standard for a significant amount of time. To kind of touch on what Tim had said, it's an interesting thought in the garages and multifamily buildings, and we've run into this just recently in Fort Collins. And what we saw, which was certainly acceptable to us, was that within a development, the builder opted to install almost exclusively the EVSE equipment within the garages because it was a significant cost saving. So for a multifamily apartment, even though there were garage spaces, they're still a part of the total number of parking spaces that were required. It just allowed them to build that infrastructure into the garages at a significant cost savings. They still met all of the other requirements of EV ready and EV capable in the outdoor parking spaces, but so it works. So.
Thank you, Brad. Elizabeth, did you still have a question? I still see your hand up or a thought. Okay.
No, sorry about that.
No worries. Will.
Thank you. Hey, sort of two thoughts that I wanted to share. So one is that as we think about going beyond the 20% requirement in the multifamily side, I think that we have some flexibility in how we do that. So I think it would be worth thinking, for instance, is there some percentage of spaces that we would simply want to require conduit? So it wouldn't be the full EV capable requirement. I think we would have the flexibility to think about that. The other thing I wanted to do is just give a little bit of perspective on where the state is forecasting EV adoption. And the state is in the process right now of updating our EV plan. The 2023 EV plan update will be going out in February, so it's not finalized, but based upon the draft EV plan that went out for public comment, we are anticipating moving forward on clean car standard adoption, so extending our existing clean car standards that set a minimum percentage of new vehicle sales that must be zero emission vehicles for each manufacturer. And by 2032, that would grow to approximately 80% of new vehicle sales. And when you then sort of project out into what does that mean for percentage of vehicles on road, we would anticipate, that by the end of the next decade, we would be above 30% of all vehicles. And that by 2050, we would be not every vehicle, but would probably be approaching, nearly all on-road vehicles being zero emission vehicles. So if you look out 30 years and are thinking about multifamily housing, nearly everybody is going to need some way to charge their vehicles based upon both sort of the projections and infrastructure investments, but also sort of the regulatory structures that the state is looking at. So just to sort of, if we're thinking about the lifetime of these buildings, I think 30 years out, you should be thinking about almost everyone needing to charge.
Thanks, Will. And just to make sure I understood your first point, are you suggesting that if we're looking at a higher percentage of EV capable spaces, that there could be an option the board could look at to run conduit for spaces, but maybe not do the electric capacity requirements for a number of those spaces, just to make sure that the physical infrastructure of the garage does not need to be ripped up in the case that those spaces are installed.
That's correct. I'm really thinking about sort of this idea that 30 years out, we're going to need charging for almost every space. But the concerns that the costs of the transformers and the electrical service, do you want people to have to spend a lot of money today to be prepared for 100% 30 years from now? Maybe there's an opportunity to think creatively there, where some percentage of spaces we could simply be removing the obstacle of having to come back and rip up concrete or trench asphalt to put in conduit. So I think that we would have that flexibility for spaces that are above and beyond the 20%, to at least consider that as one of our options for some of those spaces.
Yeah, thanks, Will. Carolyn.
Quick question for Will. You said by the end of the decade, we'd be at 30% of total fleet. Which decade was that?
That's by the end of the 2030s. So we would anticipate that by 2030, we would be in the 15 to 20% of fleet range, that we would be above 30% by the end of that decade, and then approaching 100% by the end of the following decade. Just when you look at sort of the fleet turnover time, if we're moving towards very close to 100% market share in the 2030s, then by the end of the 2040s, you're very close to the entire fleet.
Great, thank you.
Thanks, Carolyn. And Rick.
Thanks, Kim. Will, thanks for that data point. I'm going to have to jump to another call, but I wanted just to share another perspective. And if folks want to debate this a bit, I'd like to, well, I guess I'll go back to the minutes and see what the thinking is. But as it relates to the kind of back to the affordable housing piece, I often say that, the affordable housing permits in our state are, frankly, a very small fraction of the overall permits that are being pulled in the multifamily world. And, I think the multifamily market construction world can absorb a higher percentage than 20, if it's 40 or whatever that, recommendation is going to be. They could, be EV capable, or they could be EV installed now, or they could subsequently do it later as their properties increase in value in rental income. That's different than the typical affordable housing community, where it takes sometimes years before projects cash flow, just based on the capital stack and the sources of funding. Although I do think there should be, at a minimum, EV ready, capable. I think some mix makes sense even for affordable housing projects. But if we could structure in this thinking, what that AMI level could be, and I would advocate projects that are less than 30% of the area median income. That's really low income projects tied to the permanent supportive housing aspects that I alluded to earlier, would be kind of exempt from that. But otherwise, some level of participation from affordable housing new construction, around 20 or thereabouts, to get the EV capable and EV ready preparation, and then higher percentages for market rate projects, which is clearly the highest number of units in the multifamily world that we are building now in our state. So I just wanted to put that out there for additional discussion, and unfortunately I'm going to have to jump off here. Thank you.
Thank you, Rick, and thanks for being here. Elizabeth, I'll pass it to you.
Sure. Since Rick was talking about affordable housing, I'll just share what a LIHTC project, or that's the tax credit affordable projects, already have to do, so that you have that in context. For projects that have 10 or fewer parking spaces, they have to have at least one space that is EV ready, and then everything else with more than 10 spaces, at least 10% of either the total spaces or total units has to be EV ready, so that if it's parked more than 1-to-1, it's still just 10% of the units. That there are exceptions then for the permanent supportive housing that Rick mentioned. So that's like, the folks who are experiencing chronic homelessness, and that is specifically defined in CHAPA's QAP. So 10% of spaces or units, and it's EV ready, not just EV capable. Just so you have that in hand.
Yeah, thank you, Elizabeth. That's really helpful. Carolyn?
Yeah, so I wanted to go back to Will's comment about potentially creating a third definition. And thinking about the timeline for that, which is just the conduit only possibility, and just kind of put that out there. I mean, I believe, based on Will's projections, that the minimum should be 30% for multifamily, based on as EV capable per our current definition. So with service capacity, panel space, etc. Again, my starting point was 40%. I think if we can then at least think about prepping for future, so that could be spacing for future transformer, upsizing, those types of things, then I think we can err a little bit on the smaller number, but I'm not sure it should be less than 30% if we're forecasting that we're going to be at 30% of fleet within the time frame that these buildings are going to be constructed. And so that would be my starting point.
Thanks, Carolyn. And then just to make sure I'm understanding you correctly, you're suggesting that there could be an increase over the 30% that meets this current definition, that would be what Will, more along the lines of what Will suggested, just running conduit and saving space for future electric upgrades without having that be a piece of those EV capable spaces.
Correct. Like if we wanted to say an additional X% requires conduit back to the point with some other requirements. If our target is to get to, say half the spaces ultimately support the adoption rates, I think that, because I agree the incremental upfront cost is not negligible when you talk about EV capable, but I also don't want it to have to be made EV capable within 15-20 years of when the building's constructed. That's a cost. I think that surpasses our cost effectiveness in that case. And so I'm trying to come up with some balance, but I feel pretty strongly that we need to at least get to 30% EV capable, or some combination thereof. So at a minimum 30% meet one of those definitions. And I tend to agree. I mean, I was going to advocate for 10% EV ready as well. I think that's a good rate. So.
Thanks, Carolyn. So I want to save about maybe like 10-15 more minutes for continuing along Carolyn's line of thinking for what you guys would like to see, or what you'd advocate for as far as a multifamily percentage breakdown, because I think that, Carolyn, to clarify, that 30% threshold was for multifamily that you were speaking about. So is that correct? Before I assume that, I think. Okay. So I want to open up the floor to see if there are any other thoughts, and then I'm thinking what might be the best next step to follow up on this, because again, we could talk about this probably for 18 hours in a row, is that we'll take the feedback that we get, that we received today, and probably send a post-meeting survey to you guys, where we map out some scenarios of the specific percentages and try to get a little bit more dialed on where we want to land, and then use that survey data to come back and wrap up the discussion at a future meeting. So welcome any thoughts on that idea, and then any other ideas on the multifamily percentage breakdown. And Cody, I'll start with you.
I just had a question for Carolyn. Were you saying 30% EV capable in addition to 10% EV ready, or just 30% total? Okay. And
Yeah, I was going for 30% total. So we, figure out the math. So it's 10% EV ready and another 20% EV capable, if that's the distinction we went with.
Okay. And I think someone mentioned earlier something about the delta between EV capable and EV ready being rather small, given that you would just need to run the wire later and then the outlet essentially. So if we were going to go to 30%, I'd argue that we do just 30% EV capable without any EV ready, given that delta is so small.
Okay, yeah, thanks, Cody. Chris?
Hi, thanks. Just wanted to say, agree with Carolyn's point that 30% might be a floor worth considering. And, it also encourage us to consider kind of like a 40% net or a range in between, just based on fleet adoption percentages and the lifespan of buildings and, everything that's been discussed for the last hour or so. Supporting Cody's suggestion, I think a lot of the discussion so far that with the existing delta and, with an eye towards minimizing additional upfront costs, it could make sense to have a larger percentage of that total focused on capable. But I think the one place I differ is thinking that there should be some level, even a small one, of installed in new multifamily, as soon as the code is adopted. Again, to kind of create a smoother adoption pathway and kind of the signals people, especially in multifamily, need to have access to, the choices that basically the market is going to be asking them to make.
Yeah, thanks, Chris. Adam.
Thanks. So for me, I think part of it keeps coming back down to that, balancing between first cost and future retrofit. And so I had a question for Elizabeth or whoever can answer this question. For we're talking about, that there's a relatively small delta between EV capable and EV ready. And so I'm wondering, is that delta also relatively small on the retrofit side too? Or like, is there a significantly higher cost from making an EV capable space EV ready 20 years from now versus doing it now? Given the improvements that are being made and that relatively small difference.
Yeah, I think honestly, the difference between retrofitting and new construction for that delta is relatively small. It's the maybe the motivation in doing it, and you install something or you put all this capacity in, and then buildings change hands, and that even with things labeled, I think the likelihood of retrofits is there's going to be some delay there. There's a risk that I guess it could never happen, but it's not as significant a cost to retrofit that as our EV capable, which is of course the biggest lift and makes so much sense to do in the beginning. I worry about if things don't get installed, if they would ever get installed, you know what I mean?
Yeah. So I'm just to make sure I'm understanding exactly what you're saying. So you think that there would be potentially a significant barrier from getting kind of over that last hurdle to actually installing the EV infrastructure, the charging infrastructure, for someone having to go from capable to that instead of ready to that?
Yeah, I think that's right. I don't see a cost barrier per se. I see kind of a motivation barrier.
So that there would still be definitely some value in having the ready spaces to try to push them along a little faster.
I think so, because the whole point that we're doing this is try to motivate people to make the personal switch from gas vehicles to electric vehicles, and having something that you can plug in, even if it's not a fancy charger. I got to plug in my garage. Having something physical that you can plug in already there, rather than say, asking your landlord or trying to convince your HOA to install something. I see I see that being difficult for people to motivate the installation when that's not under their own control, if that makes sense.
Yeah, thanks, Elizabeth. Thanks, Adam. Cody?
Yeah, I guess maybe the other side of this would be that if there is truly some form of exponential adoption or mass adoption in the future, I think the incentive to go from EV capable to EV ready is going to be pretty simple, just based on market. If people are demanding it and need it, there's going to be an incentive to put that in. Then if there's not, then they haven't installed or they don't need to at that point. So just the other side of the coin, I guess.
Yeah, thanks, Cody. I appreciate that. Lauren?
Yeah, thanks. I just would actually like to echo, I think, Elizabeth's comments that my experience and my thought is that, and I guess I don't know what relatively small means. I don't know if there's a metric that is that 10%, more, or is that just too hard to define right now? But I do think it is really difficult, especially if we're talking about, say, 30%, of spaces being EV capable, EV ready. If you think about that in the context of 100 unit, multifamily building, and whether, like Elizabeth said, whether that is a landlord, making a decision, or in a condo building, I feel like in some cases you're almost pitting the people that have electric vehicles against those who are not. And it makes it a really hard uphill battle for folks that have, that are looking to have that upgrade made from EV capable to actually having, a functional electrical vehicle charging space in that development. So I just want to echo her comments that I think on the actual implementation side, it's just to think through, like, how does that play out, for actual tenants or homeowners trying to make that upgrade in the future.
Yeah, thank you, Lauren. Elizabeth?
Yeah, just to add on that, I think maybe it's a question of, do we want, we, the board, the state, we want the capacity that we're creating here to be ahead of the demand. And I think we do, because otherwise I think the capacity can limit that. So I like where Carolyn's going with making sure that the capacity we provide is far ahead of what the anticipated demand will be. Otherwise, I think that that's really going to limit the growth to what that wants to be. So I'd almost edge on the side of give a little bit more than we think, and potentially that could have the effect of the demand growing just as fast as the capacity does.
Thanks, Elizabeth. Adam?
I think also trying to drill down, since there seems to be maybe a little bit of interest in the chat to pursue what Will was suggesting, with as long as we meet the 20% or more for the definitions that are included in statute now, that we could still potentially go above on, a conduit only requirement. And so I was wondering, I guess my question / comment is, I'm having a hard time imagining that, while, Elizabeth, you did mention earlier that, installing conduit is not no cost, but I have a really hard time imagining that will, doing that in new construction will ever not be vastly cheaper than ripping up a parking lot or ripping up a garage later to install some conduit. And so my feeling is, I'm wondering, even if we do try to stick around this like 30, 20 to 30% for EV capable or above, what the argument against having conduit, installed in new construction in most spaces, anticipating that, by 2050, we're looking at pretty much universal EV adoption, and offsetting that major cost for a relatively low upfront cost now. And so, if folks are interested in thinking along those lines, I really think that this is an opportunity to push to pretty high percentages for conduit only, in addition to some of the lower percentages for the capable, ready, and installed.
Thanks, Adam. Elizabeth, and then to Kevin.
Yeah, I think it's a good conversation to have, but conduit alone doesn't really do us any good if we don't have the physical space for a future transformer. So like I think about some of our urban buildings, if they were to increase their electrical capacity, like we're already limited. There's nowhere to physically put a transformer. And it's not like if you need more electrical capacity, there's, Excel limits our transformer cabinets to 4,000 amps. Like that's it. If we go above that, we need a physical second transformer, and there's rules about how those have to be installed and clearance and all of that. So, the question is, and this is a building electrification question, is do you make people carve out of, demolish part of their building to have a future transformer? So just along those lines, we can't just say, put in conduit, because if there's nowhere for that conduit to end or for that future transformer, the conduit doesn't do you any good and it's just a waste of money. So, but I do like the idea of, because that is the one thing that is the most difficult to change, is the physical space for that future equipment. So we could look at a fourth definition here to have, even, I don't want to say 100%, but as you say, it's the cheapest thing to do is to put the building design around those future things. And so I would just include, if we were to do that, not just the conduit, but the future physical space for that future electric capacity, and including the transformers.
Could I also just have you opine generally on the cost impact that having that design around that structure would have?
There's some pushback there because and again, in an urban environment, you're now stealing rentable space. And that means, less square footage on the site potentially for an urban project, and not, something that's more suburban or has more site and land use availability. But for urban projects, that does dig into the bottom line.
Thanks, Elizabeth. Kevin.
I can lower my hand because Elizabeth said it all so well. The space is one thing, but it's very true about these urban projects. We find ourselves adding space for a third transformer for future electrification. So that feels like a big imposition to place on the rural folks. Would be happy to hear that urban sites have complexities too. Sometimes we have compromises, right? And then the other thing I just wanted to ask is I threw a couple of questions in the chat that are related to this, maybe for Zach Esquivel, about conduit versus raceway versus leaving room in the building. So if we can come to some way where we say, let's leave room for these things to happen, what is the most cost-effective way for conveyance or future route or path or space through the building?
This is Zach. Could you please repeat that question?
Sure. So if we're trying to find a way to allow for future routing through the buildings, what's the most cost-effective way to do that? I mean, running individual conduit, I could see that running into quite a lot of material, whereas raceway might have a little more capacity, or is there some other mechanism where we just say this is the route for future? Because we're saying somewhere between capable, ready, and just providing the space for it in the future. What's the most cost-effective way to do that?
I would say at the very beginning is to have it installed and be capable, ready, have it there ready to go. In the design of the building, in an electrical room, there is always plenty of room. I could stack 4 transformers on top of each other, 125 kVA.
I'm going to use that. I'm going to use that the next time I talk to my engineers.
there is plenty of space, especially in a commercial building. It's not like you're running any type of extra. I'm from my perspective, and I know from contractor's perspective, from a contractor's perspective, I'll go in and do that, but it's going to cost you a whole heck of a lot of money. From the worker standpoint, have it ready to go. I mean, you're talking about PVC, which I think people, when we could talk about conduit, we're thinking of metal raceway conduit. We are not talking about that underground. We are talking about PVC, which is a lot cheaper. From my standpoint, I'd rather be there and be ready, available to go. So.
And would that be the same case if it's exposed, say, in the parking structure? At that point, doesn't it need to be in metal rather than PVC?
In a parking structure, I mean,
Yeah.
in between the slats, there's plenty of raceway in between there. I mean, from an electrical standpoint, I can make it work some way. We'll make it work. But if it's there already and we have it ready to designate it to go, I mean, even in my own house, I always pull 2 or 3 raceways, just in case. So that's my perspective.
Okay. Well, again, I really appreciate this discussion. I think to make sure we have a little bit of time to continue through the rest of the discussion around commercial EV requirements, I think we'll take all of the feedback that we heard and piece together some options for the board to react to, get those out to you guys in a survey, and then ask that you guys take the time to look at that survey and respond to it so we can get some direction on how we want to assign these percentages. And note that, you know, it will come down to a 2/3 vote likely in the meeting when we vote. And so what we want to do and what we want to make sure we capture with the survey is the middle ground from the perspectives of all of the board members, so that when we get to that number that we're going to vote on, it's the closest as we could get to middle ground for what will make everyone feel good. So we might not make it exactly right for everyone's perspectives, but we are going to aim for that consensus as much as possible. So I'm going to just scroll through a bunch of slides real quick. And I think what I'd like to cover in the last 30 minutes is going through the remaining language within the 2024 IECC draft commercial code to look at different elements, additional elements within the code language that we might want to consider as part of our code language package. So again, recall that the lightning bolt are the things that we feel are not dictated by state statute, but could be included if the board so chose. So starting with EV capable spaces, and we've seen these definitions before, so this is just to reiterate what the code language says. They have to have the raceway or cable assembly shall be installed between an enclosure or outlet located within 3 feet of the space. And so that's that question of in the state statute, it says it must be adjacent to. Within the state, within the 2024 language, it says 3 feet. And we see numbers like 3 feet in a lot of the EV Ready code language around the state. We have to have the raceway and cable size to support the minimum circuit capacity. That's number 2. Number 3, the electrical distribution equipment connects and shall have sufficient dedicated space and spare electric capacity for 2-pole circuit breaker or set of fuses. So this got to the question earlier of, do we need the circuit breaker actually installed or not? So we don't, you just need the space provided in the panel. Number 4, the electrical enclosure or outlet and electrical distribution equipment directory shall be marked for future EVSE. And then the reserve capacity shall be no less than 4.1 kVA, which is in the states, or excuse me, in the 2024 code language, 20 amp, 208, 240 volt. You'll see in there, I scratched out 20 amp and added 40 amp because that is the minimum capacity as required by state statute. So I'm gonna move through sort of all of these pieces, but as there are elements of the 2024 code that the board is supportive of or would like us to include some detail around, please speak up and we can pause and discuss those elements. So moving on to EV ready spaces, again, there's that requirement that it shall terminate within 3 feet of the space that it serves. Needs to have a minimum circuit capacity, and the panel board or distribution equipment shall be designated for future EVSE, as well as the outlet or receptacle needs to have needs to be marked for future EVSE equipment. And then EVSE installed spaces need to have a minimum circuit capacity and charging rate, which we'll cover, and need to be within 3 feet of the space it serves. So looking at what those charging rates are, for each installed EVSE, they need to comply with one of the following. Capable of charging at a minimum rate of 6.2 kVA. And we see this as well within the EVSE requirements of the state statute. And then these two pieces here are different requirements if there is equipment serving multiple spaces controlled by an energy management system is number 2. That charger needs to be able to share the energy that it's giving to each one of the cars at a minimum rate of 3.3 kVA.
Hey, Kim, I think your slide didn't advance.
Oh. Thank you. I've got two going. So I was accidentally advancing the wrong one. I appreciate that. So this is the EV ready space. Well, I'm a couple slides behind now. So within the 3 feet, this is where the electric and the outlet need to be designated for future EVSE. And then this is the EVSE space requirement slide. And now here we are. Apologies for that. Thanks for catching that, Carolyn. And then, so number 3 again is when there's an energy management system providing load management, and you have EV supply equipment serving more than one space, they have to be able to simultaneously charge at a minimum rate of 3.3 kVA. And when serving electric vehicle service equipment spaces, allowed to have a minimum circuit capacity of 2.7 kVA and controlled by an energy management system, they need to be capable of simultaneously sharing the load at 2.1 kVA. And that minimum circuit capacity requirement comes in a bit later. So for circuit capacity, branch circuits need to have an 8.3 kVA rated capacity, or meet the requirements of this section. So the capacity of the branch circuit serving multiple spaces designed to be controlled by an energy management system can comply with one of the following. So they're just different requirements if you have the capacity or if you have an energy load management system in place. So each space can be served by 4.1 kVA. Or for number 2 and for number 3, if all of the spaces are designated as EV ready or EV installed, whether you're in an R2 occupancy or any other type of occupancy, so 100% of the space types are EV ready or EV installed, you're allowed to have a lower minimum capacity, excuse me, charging capacity per space in those situations. Yeah, Rob.
Hey, sorry, I'm struggling with the language here, believe it or not. So in the, if I'm struggling to interpret if whether during a peak event that the charging capacity has a key, next slide. Let's see. Go back to whatever slide was up before on the load management. Yeah. So if during a peak event, the wattage, there still needs to be 3,000 watts delivered to the charging station. It's not allowed to go below that. Am I interpreting that correctly? It's like I said, believe it or not, it's not expressly clear in the language that's on here.
I am not certain of the answer to that question, Rob. I'm not, because this doesn't define like a peak load. I think this is, I think, and others hop in.
Right, but it says controlled by an energy management system. I am interpreting that as that when it's controlled, it's due to load management issues, whether that's, but I think I'm interpreting at face value, a minimum rate of no less than 3 kVA means that it is not allowed to dip below that even in a load management event. that's what
Yeah,
I'm asking for that. I'm asking whether that's what the language actually, whether that I'm interpreting that language correctly.
I'll just offer, I believe Rob is interpreting it correctly.
I agree. And Rob, I think
Okay.
where for number 3, when this comes in, is if 100%, so moving it through the code language, if 100% of the spaces in an R2 or other occupancy are EV ready or EVSE, then you're allowed to have a lower minimum capacity, and that's the only exception.
Okay.
Okay.
Thank you.
You're welcome. And then the final piece of the 2024 code language is EV installation, and it shall just be installed according to the standards that that you see here and must be accessible per the IBC. So of the components within the 2024 code that are not necessarily dictated by state statute, we have this specification of what adjacent means. Does it mean 3 feet? Do we want to leave it as adjacent? So that I think is something to be discussed. Do we want to have labeling of the panel and the future receptacles? And then is there a minimum? We have the minimum requirement for EV supply equipment that was dictated in the state statute. But do we want to have any requirements around, when the equipment is serving multiple spaces, or if all of the spaces are EV ready or EV installed, if we want to allow for a lower charging rate. So I think those are sort of the big questions, and I'm happy to flip through slides. But Carolyn, I'll start with you.
Yeah, I will advocate for all 3. I think it's helpful to define what adjacent means and not leave that so subject to interpretation. I think labeling is appropriate and not cost prohibitive to do so. And I think per our earlier discussion, I would like to afford for the allowance of using a load management system to mitigate how much service capacity needs to be provided.
Thank you, Carolyn. Tim?
Yeah, thank you. I'm also in support of bringing this language in. It's my understanding that the 24 IECC is going to be ready, finished up at the end of the year and ready for publication first quarter of 2024. So we know there are a number of jurisdictions that are going to jump right on that throughout 2024. So it would be really nice to have consistency in the languages for jurisdictions as they move forward with this legislation and along with the 24 IECC.
Thanks, Tim. Yeah, Ron.
I'll just second both those comments. I think both Tim and Carolyn are right on target.
Thanks, Ron. Adam?
First, I will say I second both of their comments on this, and I will also note, kind of following up on Tim's discussion about when 24 IECC and how that will be adopted. I would remind folks that our second iteration of this code board too is working on this low energy and carbon code, which will likely include the 24 IECC, and thus it would having some consistency there will also make it easier to meld those two as we go forward.
Yeah, thanks, Adam. Any other thoughts from the board or anyone not necessarily in agreement around adding these different elements to our code language, including defining adjacent, requiring labeling, and having that load management allow for a lower charge rate? Okay. I'm not hearing any. So I think that this provides pretty good grounds for us to at least move forward with the draft of the code language for commercial. I also understand we all might be EV'd out at this point, a couple hours into the meeting. So So if thoughts strike you later on, please don't hesitate to send those over, and we can just continue to build this this code language out. Okay. So you guys might be shocked to know we had 96 slides we hope to get through today. This is probably slide 40. So we're going to keep going, even though I know everyone's probably a little brain dead. We're just going to move through as much of this as we can today, hoping that if we iron out a little bit of these thoughts around commercial, residential might be a whole lot easier to tackle. So there are additional commercial elements to EV codes around the state. And we shared this in meeting 4. There's all these different kind of categories of additional code language that folks have included. And so we want to walk through these and see if there's interest from the board in including language to the effect of any one of these as we go through. And I just want to flag that there are terms that are not defined in state statute that are defined elsewhere in different codes around the state and in the 2024 code that we will likely need to pull in if we start to use any of this terminology within our code language. So this is not to say we're going to wordsmith definitions and dive into this today, but all to say if we do reference some of these terms within our own code, we will need to pull definitions in, and we can do that once we get the code language drafted. So the things that are not necessarily required by state statute, but that we see pop up in other EV codes kind of fall into these 8 categories. The first is sizing of the raceway. The second is indicating EV readiness, capable, EV installed, conduit, all that good stuff on construction documentation. The third has been alluded to, and I think generally supported, but requirements around disbursement of those EV charging or EV ready or EV capable spaces, and making sure there's public access. Identification of equipment and signage requirements, accessibility requirements, which we've touched on a bit today. Service fees and limitations on charging space use. So most of that language focuses on basically not that, what am I trying to say? That a building can charge for the power that is coming out of the EV chargers. And then there's a couple safety amendments that we've seen, as you know, such as you can't have an EV charger obstructing right-of-ways or walkways, or it can't be a trip hazard. And then some permitting stuff. So I'll just kind of quickly run through these in the last 10 minutes or so. As I'm going through, because we're kind of running out of time, raise your hand if you have a comment or would like to share, speak. I'll absolutely stop and let you guys share. Otherwise, as we're going through, if you guys like any one of these, maybe drop it in the chat. Like, I support thinking about this in some fashion. That way we can kind of move through them quicker and capture all of those notes out of the chat, so we can take the first stab at the draft language here for commercial. Okay, so looking at raceway size, these are the communities over here that have adopted. Dillon, Fort Collins, Summit County have language that the raceway shall not be less than 1 nominal inch inside diameter. That they shall originate at the main service or subpanel and shall terminate at the enclosure. And they're required to be continuous at enclosed and accessible or concealed areas and spaces. So again, throw items in the chat as you like them. Construction documentation, there are a lot of different wording options for this, but at its most basic point, on construction documents unique for EV capable, you have to identify where the raceway terminates. You have to identify proposed locations. Aspen includes a requirement for information on amperage for future EVSE, wiring schematics, all of that stuff, and sufficient panel capacity as well included on the construction documents. Avon keeps it a little bit more simple. Construction documents shall designate all EV spaces, capable, ready, and EV installed spaces, and indicate the locations of conduit sizing and termination points. And then for Broomfield and Boulder, Dillon, Fort Frisco, Lafayette, Summit County, Superior, again, it's just a requirement that that these that the spaces and the wiring and the electric capacity be noted on the construction drawings themselves. And a couple more listed in the different language that you can see used there. I'm going to kind of flow through this because I think you guys kind of get the point, hopefully. For distribution and disbursement, Aspen has a requirement that one charger shall be located in common use areas and available for use by all residents. Lafayette includes that if there's multiple buildings in a multifamily R2 complex, each building has to have roughly the same access to the number of spaces. And Superior, similar language that it must be dispersed throughout the parking areas so each building has access. Again, throw in the chat if you're interested in any of these as additions. Identification and labeling is slightly different than the construction documentation in that it's just the physical labeling on the receptacle, the outlet, the panel itself, the circuit breakers, etc. So this is making sure that there's labeling in the building that's accessible so that future building owners or operators understand where all of these capabilities exist. And we see that in Aspen, Avon, and Broomfield. We've got it pretty much in almost all of the code languages that we looked at across the state. So I'm just going to continue to move through. Moving on to accessibility. So a couple of different requirements that we have here. Avon requires that when any new accessible parking is provided, at least one of the accessible spaces shall be EV ready. Boulder, City of Boulder has a similar requirement, either needs to be ready or EV installed. Denver, as we shared in meeting 4, has a definition that they added for what they term a universal space, which is a space that meets the size requirements of an accessible space. So the way that they framed it is that a minimum number of parking spaces must be universal spaces. And then of the universal spaces, a chunk of those universal spaces must fall into the EV ready designation. And then we see Dillon, Frisco, Lafayette, Summit County, Superior, that again is requiring one accessible space, but their requirement is for EV capable rather than EV ready. Continuing on for Louisville, charging station will be considered accessible if it's located adjacent to and can serve an accessible parking space, so not necessarily requiring that they have an accessible space that is EV ready. And then for electric vehicle charging stations that are meant for public use, there's sort of a number of requirements around just making sure that they're easily seen, that they're convenient, that they operate during normal business hours, and that they're maintained by whomever installs it. Okay, fees and use. Let's see, for these requirements, again, it's really just making sure that a property owner is allowed to collect fees on their EV charging station, and that they can charge for the energy that comes out of those. Looking at applicability, so these requirements are basically what we tried to pull out here is what types of projects need to comply with the EV ready requirements. So in most cases, it's all new buildings, but we do see in some of the communities that where there are alterations or on-site changes of more than a certain percentage of work area, then that triggers the EV requirement. So you can see here, Lafayette and Superior have a 50% threshold. Louisville has a 25% threshold. And the various jurisdictions just have varying applicability to when their EV codes kick in. continuing on, these are just, again, the folks that have to comply with the EV rules. And then this is the final slide we have for the other things we could consider within the commercial EV code. Safety. So the electric vehicle system protection is just making sure that they're installed in accordance with NEC Article 625. And I believe that's also referenced in the 2024 code, and shall be placed to avoid trip hazards and obstructions of sidewalk and pedestrian access. And then for Louisville, they had some permitting considerations within their EV code. So EV charging stations are permitted in every zoning district, and such stations located in single family and designated multifamily units shall be private restricted use only. If the primary use of the parcel is retail, then the use shall be considered an automotive fueling station for zoning purposes. So again, they just kind of had some distinctions on how they wanted to think about it for zoning and permitting. Okay. That is all I think we're going to get through today. Adam, yeah.
I just wanted to note on the zoning considerations for permitting. I think that that's going to be really challenging. I think each individual jurisdiction might have to address that for themselves, given that each jurisdiction probably has different zoning codes that exist, zoning and land use. So I would just say that I think that would be really challenging to include in a statewide code.
Yeah, thanks, Adam. And thanks for those of you who dropped your thoughts into the chat. Does anyone want to, in the next couple of minutes that we have, share any of the thoughts that came to mind as we looked at these additional requirements?
Just for those viewing, I think there was a lot of general comments about noting the construction documentation one as being a required code element. I think I will advocate for a lot of the others to be things that we work on and develop some consensus recommended optional code language, again, because I just think that once we put it in state code minimum, then things like that Denver universal one would be more challenging to demonstrate compliance with. I mean, I just think we get a little bit into things that were added for jurisdictional reasons that may not be statewide appropriate, or maybe too restrictive to allow for flexibility. I didn't flag anything else, but would welcome others to advocate for one of the other ones to be a mandatory. I do think there's opportunity though to provide some guidance and recommendations though on those.
Thanks, Carolyn. Anyone else want to advocate for their thoughts here?
Sorry.
Oh, please go for it.
Just quickly, the reason I said the Louisville approach, I like that better than the Denver Universal approach. There's some good sense to that Denver Universal approach, but it can also end up taking up, kind of wasting a lot of space in the parking garage, which developer clients will hate, because those bigger spaces, if they're not one or the other, can wind up taking up a lot of space, making the garage less efficient. Whereas Louisville said, you can have that for an accessible space, but it can also serve an adjacent regular space. So there's some merit to how that was written. I like that one.
Thanks, Kevin. Okay. Any last final thoughts from folks? Okay. Well, so as we can see, there is a lot to get through still with EV ready codes. And so I think, we got some good feedback from folks on these additional elements. We'll pull from the chat. So thanks for those of you who are dropping notes in there. And I think we'll likely just need to end up spending a chunk of our next meeting wrapping up this discussion. We didn't touch on EV ready for residential, although the requirements for that are a lot less complicated in that we don't necessarily need to assign a 20% allocation of spaces. It's just, figuring out within the small number of residential spaces that might go with a 1 to 2 family dwelling, how we want to require EV ready or EV capable. So with that, I guess I would just say thank you all for the robust discussion, for all of your time today. And we'll keep plugging away at this. Expect between now in the next meeting, a survey from our team that gets into the details around the percentage allocation of commercial and multifamily space types. We might also add some questions that get at the later half of this meeting, just to get some guidance from you guys on for those perspectives we didn't get feedback on, from the people we didn't hear from in the chat, which elements of these like additional nice to haves we would like to include in our code language package. And I think that's everything that I've got for you guys. So our next meeting is, let me find it, February 13th, Monday, February 13th from 12 to 3. So we'll see you guys back here then. And in the meantime, please keep an eye out from emails for me. And please do your best to either complete scheduling polls or complete surveys in the time frame that we give you. And we'll try to give you guys enough time. We know everyone's super busy, so we'll try to make sure we are being respectful of everybody's time when we give those deadlines. With that, I hope you guys enjoy the rest of your Wednesdays. Thank you all for your time and your energy and your brain power today. And we'll see you in a couple weeks.
Thanks.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.